Night did not fall gently that evening. It swallowed the wilderness. The wind moved through the rocks like whispers carrying warnings, and David pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. Every sound felt alive, shifting sand, cracking twigs, distant footsteps that may or may not have been real. He was no longer the celebrated warrior. No songs, no crowds, no victory banners. Only hiding, only running, only fear. David pressed his back against the cold wall of the cave and listened. Somewhere beyond the hills, soldiers searched for him. Trained men, armed men, men who once fought beside him. Now they hunted him. His breathing grew shallow. "How did my life become this?" he whispered. Just months earlier, he had stood in royal courts. Now he counted shadows, wondering if morning would ever come. He moved deeper into the cave, careful not to let his sandals scrape against stone. The darkness felt thick, almost physical. Every step reminded him of something terrifying. God had anointed him king, but he was living like a fugitive. The promise and the reality did not match, and that confusion hurt more than the danger. David sat down, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of uncertainty. What if I misunderstood God, he thought. That was the fear no one talks about, not fear of enemies. Fear that maybe heaven had gone silent. Outside, a distant shout echoed. David froze. Torches flickered across the hills. They were close. He lowered himself to the ground, heart pounding so loudly he feared it would betray him. Dust filled his lungs as he tried to breathe quietly. This was not heroic. This was survival. And in that moment, David was not a fearless man of faith. He was tired. He was overwhelmed. He was human. Sometimes faith does not look like confidence. Sometimes faith looks like hiding in the dark and choosing not to give up. David closed his eyes. Memories flooded in. The lion, the bear, the giant he once faced without hesitation. Where did that courage go, he wondered. But courage had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Before, courage stood on battlefields. Now, courage meant trusting God when nothing made sense. If you've ever felt like God promised something, but your life looks completely different right now, pause and type, "I'm still trusting" in the comments. You're not alone in this journey. The voices outside grew louder. Metal clanged, boots crushed gravel. David's pulse raced. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The cave had only one exit. If they entered, it was over. He leaned his head against the stone and whispered words that would later become a psalm. God, be merciful to me. Not a king's prayer, not a warrior's speech, just a desperate man speaking honestly. Fear has a way of stripping away performance. In the dark, David stopped pretending to be strong. He told God exactly how he felt. I am surrounded. I am afraid. I feel forgotten, and something began to change. Not outside, inside, because peace often begins before circumstances move. Suddenly, footsteps approached the cave entrance. Torchlight spilled across the walls. David held his breath. A shadow appeared. One man entered, then another. Soldiers. David pressed himself flat against the rock, hidden in darkness just beyond the light. This was the closest death had ever come. He could hear their conversation, hear their armor shifting, hear the exhaustion in their voices. One of them laughed. They had no idea he was there. Time slowed. David realized something shocking. The men searching for him were vulnerable. For a brief moment, he could have ended everything. One strike, one decision. Freedom. The temptation rushed through him. Maybe this is God's answer, his mind whispered. But deep inside, another voice spoke louder. Trust is not proven when victory is easy. Trust is proven when revenge is possible. And you choose obedience instead. David lowered his weapon. He chose restraint. He chose faith over control. The soldiers eventually stood and left. Their footsteps faded into the night. David collapsed to his knees. He was alive not because he fought, because God protected him in silence. Tears filled his eyes as realization settled in. God had been present the entire time, even when fear screamed louder than faith. If this part of the story speaks to you, take a moment to like this video. It helps this message reach someone else who may be fighting silent battles tonight. Morning came quietly. No trumpets, no victory. Only pale light stretching across the wilderness. David stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the horizon turn gold. For a moment, everything looked peaceful, almost normal. But peace outside did not erase the reality inside. He was still a hunted man. Somewhere beyond those hills, King Saul was awake and still determined to find him. David stepped forward carefully, scanning the valleys below. Every movement mattered now. Every path could either save his life or end it. Behind him, a few loyal men began to stir, exhausted followers who had chosen uncertainty over safety just to stay with him. They looked at David not just as a leader, but as hope, and that weight pressed heavily on his heart, because inside, David still felt afraid. They began moving through narrow mountain paths, avoiding open ground. The sun rose higher, heating the rocks beneath their feet. Hunger gnawed at them, water was scarce. One of the younger men stumbled. Another quietly asked, "David, how long can we keep running?" David didn't answer immediately, because he didn't know. Leadership sometimes means walking forward without answers. He remembered the palace again, warm meals, music, structure, certainty. Now every day felt unpredictable. And the hardest part wasn't danger, it was waiting for God's promise to make sense. By midday, they reached a dry ravine. The silence felt heavy. Even birds seemed absent, as if the land itself held its breath. David climbed a ridge to look ahead. Then he saw it, dust rising in the distance. Movement, an army. Saul's men were closer than ever. His chest tightened. They found us again. Fear returned instantly, not slowly, not politely, but like a wave crashing without warning. Faith does not prevent fear from revisiting. Sometimes fear comes back stronger after moments of peace. They ran through thorns that tore their clothing, across uneven rocks that cut their feet, down slopes where one wrong step meant death. The wilderness became an obstacle course of survival. David's lungs burned, but he kept moving, guiding his men toward higher ground. Behind them, horns echoed faintly. The chase had begun again. Hours passed. Finally, they reached another hiding place, a cliffside stronghold surrounded by steep drops. Safe, for now. The men collapsed from exhaustion, but David could not rest. He walked alone toward the edge and looked down at the endless desert. His thoughts grew louder than the wind. God, how long? That question carried pain, not rebellion, just weariness. Because sometimes the hardest prayer is not asking for rescue. It's asking why rescue hasn't come yet. He remembered Samuel pouring oil over his head years earlier. "You will be king." Those words once felt glorious. Now they felt confusing. Why would God promise elevation and allow isolation? Why anoint him, only to send him into hiding? David sank to his knees. Tears came quietly. This was not weakness. This was honesty. There are seasons when you believe God spoke to you about your purpose, your future, your calling, but your present life looks nothing like the promise. David lived in that tension. Between prophecy and reality, between faith and fatigue, night returned. Fires burned low to avoid detection. Hunger sharpened tempers among the men. Whispered arguments broke out. Fear spreads quickly in groups. One man muttered, "Maybe God abandoned us." The words cut deeply, because David had secretly wondered the same thing. He stood and spoke softly. "We are still here. That means God is still with us." He wasn't speaking from certainty, he was choosing belief. And sometimes faith is simply refusing to agree with despair. Later that night, David couldn't sleep. The stars stretched endlessly above him. He stared upward, remembering nights as a shepherd boy, when trusting God felt simple. Back then, danger came from lions. Now danger came from people, from betrayal, from disappointment. He whispered another prayer that would become part of a psalm. "You keep track of my wandering. You collect my tears." For the first time, David realized something powerful. God was not only present in victories, God was attentive to suffering. Every tear mattered. Every fearful step was seen.
Suddenly, footsteps approached. A scout rushed toward him. "David, Saul's camp is below us." David followed him to the edge. There they were, hundreds of fires glowing in the darkness. So close, close enough to hear distant voices, close enough to feel the tension. And then something unexpected stirred inside David. Not fear, compassion. He looked at Saul, once his mentor, once his protector, now consumed by jealousy and paranoia. David realized something painful. Saul was lost long before David started running. That night, David made a dangerous decision. He quietly descended toward Saul's camp with one trusted companion. Every step risked death. Guards surrounded the area. Spears rested nearby. Yet somehow they reached the center unnoticed. There lay Saul unasleep, the man chasing him, the man trying to kill him, defenseless. Again, destiny placed opportunity in David's hands. One strike and the suffering would end. His companion whispered, "God has delivered your enemy." The temptation returned stronger than ever. End the pain, take control, force the promise to happen. David's hand trembled, but he stepped back. "I will not harm him." Because David understood something most people miss. Peace built through disobedience never lasts. He took only Saul's spear and water jug, proof he had been there, and left silently. At sunrise, David stood on a distant hill and called out, "Why do you chase me?" His voice echoed across the valley. Saul woke, realizing how close he had come to death. For a moment, truth broke through Saul's madness. He wept, he admitted David's righteousness. But David knew something important. Apologies do not always change people. Healing sometimes means keeping distance. David turned away and walked back into the wilderness. Still not king, still waiting. But different now, because peace had finally begun growing inside him. Not from changed circumstances, but from surrendered control. Years later, people would read David's Psalms and feel comfort. They would hear confidence, they would sense peace. But few would realize those words were written by a man who ran through deserts, cried in caves, wrestled with doubt, and chose trust again and again. The Psalms of peace were born from seasons of fear, and maybe that is why they still speak today. Because they remind us you can be afraid and faithful at the same time. You can feel lost and can still be led. You can walk through darkness and then still be becoming who God promised. David walked forward into another unknown day. Not fearless but trusting, and somewhere behind him fear lost its power, because trust had finally taken root.